So anyway, it was in about the year 312 into 313 that Constantine came to power. I'd like to give you his full name. You might want to make a note of this. Caius Flavius Valerius Aurelius Claudius Constantius Magnus was the name. So you make a note of that. I'll quiz you at the end. But most people don't recall him by that full name, but simply by the name Constantine the Great. The term the Great has been associated with him largely as a result of Christian remembrance of him, because of course he is the first one, unprecedented in Roman history, who actually not only acknowledges but endorses and embraces the Christian faith as his own, and certainly encourages the Roman world to follow suit. I think it's safe to say that from a historical point of view, the greatness of Constantine would be measured more by what he did than by what he was. And I'll try to fill that out a little bit as we go. But what he was a most gifted and able successor to the Roman world. One of the finest Roman emperors, to be sure. One of the most really competent leaders of the Roman world to that time. He is the first representative in church history of a notion, an experiment, if you will, that was to be tried many times later, called a Christian theocracy. Now, for some people, that's a very loaded term and has a lot of baggage, and I hope you'll kind of disabuse yourself of some of what you may think that is. But just the idea that, experimenting with the idea that a state could be officially Christian and actually implement Christian legislation and throughout its entire social structure try to put in place Christian law, Christian politics, Christian judicial thought, and so on. No one is prepared to say that this was a dazzling success. Even the greatest apologists of Constantine will admit that there was a kind of undiscriminating and harmful confusion of church and state that took place under his rule. But nevertheless, he was the first guy to try. And for that, we need to at least recognize the importance of it. We look at Constantine from, 1,700 years distant, and it's easy to pass judgments. But remember, this was the first time everyone ever tried this. And at the time, of course, this interesting experiment had some, good results and not so good results. And it's seeing the difference and so on that really is the task we have before us. Many have tried to look at Constantine and figure out what drove him, kind of psychoanalyze him from 1,700 years later. That's always an interesting task, and I think those who've done it the most sanely have noticed that he had mixed motives. So let's grant that. Certainly part of what drove Constantine were what you would call political motives. Recognizing that Christianity had become so deeply entrenched, become such an important part of the Roman world by that time, that the only thing he could do was find a place for it. And I think he decided to go beyond that and actually, as it were, co-opt the power of Christianity to his own advantage. And maybe that's good, maybe it's bad. One thing is clear, that by the time Constantine came along, the force and the power and the vitality of the Christian faith in the culture had made a Constantine inevitable. If it wasn't him, it would be someone. Somebody was going to recognize you just can't fight this anymore. It had become too deeply entrenched. And so the fact that it was this particular Constantine who happened to be the one is remarkable, and we should note that. But somebody was going to be the one who would be, as it were, the Constantine of history. He was bright enough to see that really this was a power and a force and a momentum that could probably be used to his advantage. So while all of the emperors preceding him had aligned themselves at the head of official pagandom, he was the one who aligned himself then with official Christendom and stepped to that side of the fence and really defined himself pretty much in that manner. At the same time, allowing that sort of cynical view of Constantine, that he was simply seeing the handwriting on the wall and as a brilliant emperor deciding he would simply use this rising force to his own political advantage, allowing all of that, I still have to say, I think, and not that my opinion matters all that much. But I think there's some pretty competent historians who've looked at him and also allowed that there really was a true Christian faith in there, at least eventually. If not initially, it seems that at some point something really did gel with him. It never was truly clear or truly deep in the sense that we might have found it in some of the great fathers of the church. Certainly throughout his life it seemed to be mixed with a kind of superstitious element, attaching too much significance to kind of the symbology of the church, the potency of the cross simply as a symbol, that sort of thing. We would be offended from a Protestant perspective now at this distance of seeing that kind of what we would consider a sort of a hocus-pocus kind of mysticism. Nevertheless, even inside of that, it seems that there may have been something that was genuine and real going on within him. His own religious history is interesting. He started more or less as a product of the Neoplatonism and Gnosticism that we've talked about in the last couple of weeks that were part of what precipitated the Nicene Council. By 308, which is still, of course, before he came to power, he was offering sacrifices to Apollo. So he was thoroughly invested in the idolatrous culture of the day by then. Even in 321, he was consulting with soothsayers and others who would reflect something other than a Christian perspective. To the end of his life, he retained the title Pontifex Maximus, which had its roots in paganism. But at the same time, you find this kind of mixture of Christianity. The coinage under Constantine began to show Christ on one side and the sun god on the other, that kind of thing. The two of us would be quite offensive, really. But at the time, people actually saw that it might be a step in the right direction. Who knows? You can take that for what you think it's worth. But it does seem that as his life unfolded, there was a gradual movement, a kind of increasing tilt toward a purer kind of Christianity than we might have found at the beginning. He was not baptized till the very end of his life. That, again, has been an interesting question. I'll say a little bit more about that before we're done. But some have viewed that somewhat cynically, that he wanted to kind of live it up, as they say, and then save baptism for the very end, a deathbed conversion kind of deal. That's not exactly what that was about, but it is interesting that he saved his baptism till the end. Personally, Constantine was quite a bigger-than-life figure. He was very tall, he was very handsome, broad-shouldered, very vigorous, good health, kind of one of those people that walks into a room and has a sort of presence that you just sense that there's someone important around. But he was given to too much excess in his demeanor. He was noted as being rather vain, certainly appreciated the praise of people, and was probably too susceptible to flattery. He was not a person of a highly cultivated mind philosophically. He was not a Marcus Aurelius, for example, of an earlier time, who was kind of a Stoic philosopher / emperor, or an Antoninus Pius, who pictured himself as a great religious figure. But he was a man of shrewd intelligence as a political leader and a statesman. And that in some ways accounts for how he could make use of Christianity the way he did. He always had a way of landing on his feet, in terms of his political battles and so on. If you look at his moral character, you have to say that he was really pretty impressive. Many of these emperors were anything but a paragon of virtue, as you probably know, and their sexual escapades and other kinds of moral lapses would not be the kind of thing that you'd want your kids to grow up and emulate, But when it came to Constantine, he was really quite a chaste man. He was not characterized at all by those sorts of excesses, and indeed did represent something of a higher virtue among the emperors than one might have otherwise seen. I'm not going to say he was an exemplar of Christian morality. I'm not going to go that far, but nevertheless, he certainly stood above some of his contemporaries in terms of the Roman imperial history. He was a liberal man. By liberal, I mean generous, to the point of being wasteful. He loved to give away gifts of great value and wealth, and loved the praise that came to him, as a result of doing that. We see a little bit of that in terms of the history of Christianity in a moment. However, much of his legislation, you have to say, did breathe a spirit of Christian balance. He moved in the direction of Christian legislation. There is such a thing as legislation that reflects a more biblical view of things. There is, from a Christian perspective, good law and bad law. We are not insulated from political life, and Constantine recognized that. For example, much of his law, much of the legislation that came under Constantine elevated the status of women, gave them the right, can you believe this, to hold property, gave them rights in marriage that they had never had before, certainly attached to the female sex in that culture a certain kind of worth and independent status that was unprecedented up until that time. That would certainly reflect a true Christian move. He also did a great deal to ameliorate the horrible conditions of slaves. I can't say that he just, wholesale emancipated all the slaves of the ancient world. It probably wouldn't even be possible to do that. But nevertheless, he certainly put in place protections that prevented the kinds of wholesale abusive treatment of slaves that had been commonplace up until that time. Those and many other kinds of legislation certainly reflected more of a Christian conscience, and that came through in many different ways in spite of other lapses that we might have seen in his life. Eusebius is a contemporary of his. Eusebius of Caesarea is sometimes called the father of church history. Eusebius paints Constantine in absolutely unbelievably complimentary terms, almost to the point you'd confuse him with the Messiah, you see. Really paints a picture of Constantine that is unrealistically positive. Now, you can understand why Eusebius did that, because he had been spending his life detailing the horrendous circumstances of Christians up until that time. And I'm sure Eusebius personally, privately, was utterly overjoyed with gratefulness that now finally imperial Rome was not simply tolerating Christianity, but indeed endorsing it. And so I want to be forgiving of Eusebius if he went a little bit overboard, you see, in his positive estimate of Constantine. But there's a risk in that, and the risk is that the picture of Constantine through the lens of Eusebius tended to paint him so unrealistically positively that when people later went back and looked at his life and began to see that there were some true faults there was a tendency to overreact and paint Constantine in very negative terms. And I've read descriptions of Constantine where you would think the man was virtually satanic, you see. Almost like the disappointment that he didn't meet Eusebius' standard means immediately we paint him in the most grotesque possible terms and treat him in the most cynical kinds of unfair ways. That's easy to do. I mean, we see that kind of revisionism all the time. People go back. I grew up in a culture in my schooling that said Columbus was a great hero. Well, now you have people find some faults in Columbus, and immediately he becomes a great villain. Or you look at John Calvin, a wonderful life, but somebody picks out the execution of Michael Servetus and Calvin's little part in that, and immediately Calvin becomes a great villain, Or Martin Luther, who said some unfortunate things about Jewish people, and immediately his whole life is reinterpreted in light of those things, which, nobody's trying to, defend that, but at the same time, it may miss the, the bigger picture for the sake of that. I mean, to be honest with you, I'd hate to have any of you in this room find the one or two worst things that I ever did, and then reinterpret my whole life in terms of those things. I mean, I probably don't deserve any better, but at the same time, I think most of us would feel that's a little unfair to sort of latch on to the one or two black marks that are certainly there, but discount everything else in that regard. And that's kind of the treatment that Constantine has gotten at some hands, that the fact that he was a little bit less than perfect at some points has served to really discount, all of the things that he might otherwise have accomplished that were good. And probably the biggest black mark in Constantine's life was that in the conflict between himself, he was the emperor of the western part of the Roman world, and Licinius, who was the emperor of the eastern part and happened to be his brother-in-law, that eventually erupted into a battle in which Constantine was victorious. And after the battle, he summarily executed Licinius, which may be understandable, but also executed Licinius's young son. And for that, he's never been forgiven in history. That seemed to be going beyond the bounds of what was necessary. And usually, if you read somebody really trying to give a radical critique of Constantine, that's the first thing they'll name, was this gratuitous execution of this young, either teenage or even less than teenage son of Licinius. Best to leave Constantine as a kind of transitional figure. He was very concerned with the advance of the church, but more concerned with its outward advance probably than its inward mission. He was praised, however, widely both by Christians and by pagans as a great emperor in spite of the faults that you might find in him. He's not unlike other figures in history who've had a relationship to Christianity and yet also been a little bit Machiavellian in their, Peter the Great comes to mind, and others where you find a sort of mixture there in the way that they carry themselves in their statesmanlike responsibilities. Philip Schaff says of him the following, which I think is a pretty good description, quote, "Not a decided, pure, and consistent character, he stands on the line of transition between two ages and two religions, and his life bears the plain marks of both." Constantine himself said at the time of his baptism, which was shortly before he died, these words, quote, "Now let us cast away all duplicity." As if he himself felt the duplicitous character of the way in which he had to live and carry out his responsibility as the Roman emperor. It's a difficult thing to be a politician and a Christian. Some people think it's tough to be a lawyer and a Christian, and some people doubt it can be done. Some of us in this room are still working on it. But I think it's even harder to be a politician and a Christian. You're really having to balance an awful lot of competing interests there. And the number of times that you find yourself in some kind of compromise with the highest and best of your Christian ethic has got to be virtually daily. And so this is the kind of problem that I'm sure Constantine faced. And at the end of his life, when he was prepared to say, "Now let's cast away this duplicity," at least in some ways suggests he was aware of it personally and had finally come to a point where he wanted to make this kind of complete surrender of his heart and life to the Christian faith as he understood it. Anyway, that's a little bit of a prologue to his life. I'd like to just run through briefly kind of a quick chronology of Constantine's life and place during this transitional moment. He was born the son of the co-emperor in the Roman world, Constantius Chlorus. As you may know, the Roman world at that point was in two parts. There was the eastern and the western. This has been an ongoing debate between east and west, a conflict really in the Roman world, and that was the case. So Constantine was born the son of the western emperor there, Constantius Chlorus. He was born in 272 in Britain. His mother was named Helena. Helena has often been likened to the great mothers that come along in church history, sort of like Monica, the mother of Augustine, who prayed for Augustine's conversion all during his life till he finally came to faith in his early 30s. Helena has been compared to her, probably is not quite of her caliber. It's not altogether clear when she came to the Christian faith, although it seems that she did at some point. She does appear to be a discreet and devout woman who certainly, at least in many ways, reflected a true Christian virtue, but never at any great level of heroic status, anything like that. She has been given the status of saint in the Roman Catholic Church. She was canonized a few years after her death, for whatever that may be worth, but nevertheless, she certainly does have some status there in terms of being an example for us of Christian womanhood. Early in his life, Constantine himself served in the military forces under Diocletian, who I mentioned earlier as one of the great persecutors of the church. He served in military expeditions in Egypt and in the Persian Wars. Shortly before his father's death, Constantius named him the co-emperor there of the Western Roman Empire. Interestingly, it's probably the father of Constantine that first gave the impression or made the imprint in Constantine that these Christian people were not being treated appropriately. His father, Constantius, viewed the Christian people as the most peaceable and honorable of his citizens. which many Christians had pointed out repeatedly that they were to the emperor. They pay their taxes. They drive the speed limit. They're not your problem. Your jails are not filled with Christians for crimes against the state unless it's the crime of being a Christian, which is manifestly absurd, that we would be jailed on that. That was kind of the apology that was being mounted. And Constantius seems to have gotten the message. He couldn't fathom why these people who were so harmless and indeed were a positive good in the society were treated the way they were. And he seems to have given that impression to Constantine, his son, at an early age. Constantine himself is quoted by Eusebius as having said these words when he first came to power, quote, "My father revered the Christian God and uniformly prospered, while the emperors who worshiped the heathen gods died a miserable death. Therefore, that I may enjoy a happy life and reign, I will imitate the example of my father and join myself to the cause of the Christians, who are growing daily while the heathen are diminishing." So Constantine, like I say, I don't know that this reflects really a true Christian faith, but it's kind of a pragmatic recognition that, it just kind of goes better for folks if they'll align themselves somewhat more favorably toward this Christian movement. And he notices the abysmal and unhappy circumstances of those who continue to embrace paganism and all of that which goes with it. And so he seems to have been bright enough to figure that out. I wouldn't want to attribute to that particular statement any evidence of Christian conversion. I would call that rather pure pragmatism, but the guy was smart enough to see that, and for that I think he deserves some kind of credit. Obviously, the most important and famous incident in the life of Constantine is the vision of the cross. That's what usually, if you know anything about Constantine, that'll be what happens. Basically what happened there, this was before Constantine had come to power, there was a kind of a marauding conqueror out of Africa whose name was Maxentius. And he had come in and really usurped the authority of Italy and Africa. He was universally hated by the people in Rome, and they appealed to Constantine, who was the heir apparent to the Western Roman Empire, to come and rescue them. So Constantine mustered an army of some 98,000, marched across Gaul, that is modern France, across the Alps, and came down to engage this Maxentius in battle. It was a close call. There were two battles that were fought in which Constantine won marginal victories. But it was by no means clear-cut what the ultimate outcome was going to be. And the third battle seemed to be sort of, gearing up to take place at a location called the Milvian Bridge, which is not far from Rome. And Constantine was concerned about what the outcome of that might be. Both sides had suffered losses. Constantine certainly suffered some losses. The outcome was uncertain, and that was the basic setting. It was in that setting that this vision of a cross took place with the emblem upon it, "By this conquer," which Constantine took to be a message that he should, as it were, emblazon upon his army the sign of the cross. On the shields, on the flags, on the banners, on the swords, on everything, the sign of the cross, and that by that means Constantine would conquer. He did, in fact, conquer, won a massive victory over Maxentius, and that really represents, as a matter of political history, the, as it were, practical conquest of Christianity over paganism. It also marks, I think one would have to say, the time when military and political interests were mixed deeply into the Christianity of the time. And so it's a little good, a little ill. I think we can see the risks and the hazards of what took place at that time. The vision itself has been the subject of a great deal of dispute, exactly what happened there. There's actually two versions of the story. One is the earlier one, probably the more credible, from a source named Lactinius, who was a contemporary and knew Constantine, and says that what happened was that Constantine saw a vision, like a night vision. And the vision that he saw was this cross in the sky, and on the cross the words, "By this conquer. He was so impressed by it as he took that as a vision from God himself, and thereupon went and rallied his troops around that particular message, and so on. The later version, which is more doubtful, but certainly a lot more dramatic, is that Constantine not only saw this vision, but his whole army saw the vision. It was in broad daylight, and they saw this huge cross in the sky with the words on it, "By this conquer." So that's the two versions of the story that you'll hear. And in any event, as a result of that, then you have this army really adopting a Christian symbolism, more or less almost superstitiously, but nevertheless adopting it as the means whereby they would conquer. So what really happened? I don't know. I don't know that anyone does. We can kind of muse about this from a historical perspective. There are those who have taken the position that this was, in fact, a genuine miracle. And that report is always filtered down through church history, that it actually happened, that there was this huge cross in the sky. I have to say I have a gut reaction to that that's a little bit negative. I don't think that's probably what happened. I think we would probably all admit from a Christian point of view that seems a little doubtful, that there'd be a personal visitation on Constantine, a miraculous display of the cross, as the means whereby he would win a great military victory. You know, I mean, not that necessarily Christians are opposed in principle to war. Some are, but many have adopted a just war theory that says sometimes Christians should be engaged in war, that that's not necessarily intrinsically evil. That's a debate, you understand that. But so I'm not saying that it was you could never imagine someone going to war with some sense of a Christian duty in doing so. But that there would be a miraculous visitation to say, "By this symbol conquer," has struck, at least I think, some historians from a Christian perspective as doubtful. On the other extreme, there has been the argument, well, this was just a fraud. This was just Constantine inventing something for purely practical purposes. He wanted to go to his army with something. And so he goes to his army with, "Hey guys, guess what? Last night I saw a vision that we would conquer under the sign of the cross." And they were willing to buy off on that, and there you go. That's not likely either. Constantine stuck to this story that there had been a miraculous vision that he had seen all through his life, and even up to the point of his death. He included that as part of his Christian testimonial. And to a man who really did believe that telling a lie on such a subject would put him in hell for eternity, it seems unlikely that Constantine would have, just clung to that fabrication throughout his life. It seems less likely that Eusebius would have been a party to a known lie or known fabrication. So both of those extremes have been probably viewed as more doubtful. There's a couple of intermediate possibilities that may have a little more credibility. Some have suggested, well, maybe this was a natural phenomenon. Maybe the army looked up in the sky and saw clouds configured as a cross. And that's what it took. But the problem with that is they not only saw the cross, but they saw the words, "By this conquer," on the cross. I don't know, if you can see that in the clouds, that is a miracle, That qualifies right there. That puts us right back on the miracle side of it. So probably, most likely, I think the sanest historical commentators have said probably what was going on was that this really was truly some kind of vision. Whether we want to call it miraculous, I don't think that's necessary. Certainly providential. Constantine viewed Maxentius as a man given over to heathen practice. He was an idolater who engaged in the most ghastly forms of bloodshed in the idolatrous practices which he engaged in and endorsed. Constantine, who was going against him in battle, understood that the Christian God was no part of the religion of Maxentius. And already being sensitized to the, you might say, efficacy of the Christian faith generally, the way the staying power of these people and so on, and the influence of his father, was probably already entertaining the idea that this could be virtually a war between these two deities, as it were. At least we're trying to do a little bit of speculating here. In that light, Constantine may very well have been praying to the Christian God. Not that he was a Christian in his heart, but that may very well have been what's going on. We certainly have evidence to that effect. And it may very well be that in that context he did see in his mind's eye some kind of vision, whether in a dream or something like that, of that cross and conquering in the name of the cross. It's almost impossible not to believe that something didn't happen in Constantine's conscious experience, because this was such a radical turning point in his life that it just seems that there must be some basis in fact that gives rise to it. In any event, this army of Constantine won the battle on October 29th, 312, against Maxentius, and Constantine was welcomed into Rome shortly thereafter as a conquering hero. They put up a statue of Constantine holding in his hand a cross. Constantine himself gave a great speech at that time in which he said, quote, "By this saving sign," referring to that cross, the true token of bravery, I have delivered your city from the yoke of the tyrant. So Constantine gives credit to the power of the cross for liberating these people from the tyrannical rule of Maxentius. That really marked, as I said earlier, the victory of Christianity over paganism. Thereafter, the cross was stamped on everything. I mean, that city, that became, like before the Mariners were about to go to, what is it called, the World Series, when they were, close to, you saw the Mariners emblem everywhere, didn't you? I mean, it was on license plates, it was on doors and stores and everything. Well, that was kind of the way it was with the cross. It became almost sort of the, logo, you might say, within Rome at that point. It was stamped on coinage. It was stamped on, standards and helmets and shields and all kinds of things. And so that was really, at that point, a kind of conversion, although most of us would not want to call it any kind of meaningful conversion, but sort of a superstitious conversion in Rome at that point to this God of the Christians. You can imagine, however, if you were a Christian, how that might have affected you. You had been now for some 200 years, you and your family before you, the subject of the most vicious persecution by this Roman world, which now has all of a sudden, virtually in a heartbeat, adopted with great glee and joy the very central symbol of your faith. I mean, many of these Christians viewed this. They thought they thought they died and gone to heaven. They thought this was, the beginning of the millennium. They thought that now, finally, there's been this radical turning point. And the problem is, what gradually happened over time was depth of faith began to be exchanged for a very broad, but not so deep faith, in the entire culture over time. Shortly after the victory that he won, Constantine issued what's called the Edict of Milan. This was in January of 313. It was just after he became the emperor in the West. That granted full religious freedom to all religions, including Christianity. It was an edict of toleration of all religions. It would not be of the same character as the toleration of religions that came following the Reformation. That was much deeper and much more principled. Rome was still too authoritarian to really think of such a thing. And so really what this represented was kind of a step away from authoritarian paganism toward authoritarian Christianity, and this was the intermediate point, which sort of was tolerating everything for a while. And so I don't want to read in too much of that, but nevertheless it was a great moment for Christian people. Over the next 10 years or so, Constantine put in place all kinds of legislation that was sympathetic to Christians. So in 313, he exempted clergy from service in the Roman military. He abolished all kinds of practices in Rome that were offensive to Christians, particularly infanticide, abortion, that kind of thing was ruled illegal very early. He facilitated the emancipation of Christian slaves in 316. He legalized the right to leave a bequest to the church in 321. He enjoined upon the Roman world the observance of a Sunday Sabbath in 321, which was commonly practiced already, but he made that part of the law. of the land. He contributed liberally to the building of churches here and there around the Roman world, gave his sons a Christian education, and of course, as Constantine set the standard for this kind of move to Christianity, you saw that in the culture as well. But again, as I say, the faith began to be sort of paper thin. It used to be deep, now it was broad, but not very deep. There was one day, for example, in Rome, in which there were 12,000 converts to the Christian faith. I don't even know that Billy Graham, has a convert. That's a pretty good day of evangelistic work, where you get 12,000 converts. But of course, what you realize is that after each person was baptized, Constantine gave them a brand new white suit and 20 pieces of silver. Well, there you go. It's kind of a little inducement, and you begin to wonder just what was in the hearts of some of these people as they were, converting to the Christian faith. And this is where I say, we look at this from the perspective of our moment in history, and we can be quite harsh and judgmental about that. But I think if we were living at the time, we might realize that given where the church had just been, as misguided as that is, as much as we would not want that to become the norm for the way in which, we don't want to start in our Presbyterian baptism giving people $20, when they are baptized. It's not where we want to go. That's really not the idea that we're driving at. But nevertheless, given the huge and sort of cataclysmic change, the paradigm shift, if I can use that term, that was going on, I think some of these abuses become somewhat more understandable, if not excusable. There was the conflict with Licinius I mentioned earlier. That took place in 324, and at that point in 324, Constantine became emperor of the entire Roman world. So it was reunited then under one head, and that was Constantine. That was really again viewed as a great victory of Christianity over paganism, because Licinius was hostile to Christianity. And so again, those who'd lived under his regime viewed Constantine as a conquering hero, a Christian hero, to liberate them from the assault against them and their faith that had come at the hands of Licinius. And even though Constantine executed Licinius and executed his young son, nevertheless at the time he was still viewed in quite positive terms in that regard. In 325, Constantine issued what was called a general exhortation to the Roman world to become Christian. Now again, this was not a demand. He wasn't saying become Christian or off with your head. It was kind of the bully pulpit, you might say, of the Roman emperor, encouraging people in that direction. And of course, many people did. In 325, he also presided over the Nicene Council. We talked about that last week, you recall. Took an active role within it. Probably his theological insight was much more limited than those who were participating, but nevertheless, he certainly had his influence in that process. From 325 to 329, he erected all kinds of beautiful churches and other kinds of shrines on holy places in and around Jerusalem. And so he put a lot of money into that. In 330, however, he was so deeply disappointed at the fact that Rome was not really owning a true Christian faith, and still a lot of the indicia of paganism was here and there throughout, that he finally despaired of the city and moved the capital of the Roman world from Rome to Byzantium, renaming it after himself Constantinople. And that's where he lived for the last 7 years of his life. He turned Constantinople into a kind of Christian Rome, put up a bunch of cathedrals and churches and so on, and his own life of worship was really exemplary. He would come to church. Sermons in those days were quite lengthy. It was not unusual to hear an hour and a half or 2 hour sermon. Constantine would come and stand in poised attention during the entire sermon, showing his respectful reverence for the preaching of the Word of God. And so he was very diligent in participating in service. He actually preached a few sermons in those years. A couple of them we have available to us to this day. I won't read any of them to you, but nevertheless, they're not bad. They're not as good as Woody, understand, but they're not bad. And they really kind of represent a general defense of Christianity. You'd call them sort of an apologetic sermon. in which he argues the truth of the Christian faith based on fulfilled prophecy and the obvious improvement in the moral character of people that comes by virtue of embracing the Christian faith. And he, at the same time, assaults idolatrous paganism and shows its faults and its immoralities and so on. It's that kind of sermon, that sort of genre that you find in those sermons. It's not, really not too bad as preaching goes in church history. He, in spite of his overt commitment to the Christian faith, did not ever simply outlaw heathen religion or pagan religion. And in fact, some of his officials within his government were still pagan in their religion. He did tend to prefer Christians and put them in the highest offices, but nevertheless, he was never quite so severe in his judgments against non-Christians. As I indicated earlier, he postponed his baptism until shortly before his death, which has always been perplexing to people as to why would he do that. And of course, those who have a more harsh judgment of Constantine have viewed this really as great evidence that he never was truly a believer and this was a deathbed conversion kind of deal. That's probably not fair. Actually, it was not uncommon at that time for people to postpone their baptism until the end of their life. The reason for that was because there was a widespread belief, misguided to be sure, but nevertheless a widespread belief, that if you committed a very serious sin, which came to be called a mortal sin, after your baptism, you would irretrievably lose your salvation. And so some people thought, you never know when you're going to have a bad day. And so they would sort of, as a practical concern, maybe postpone, at least for a while, their baptism until at least they, as the saying goes, sowed their wild oats and kind of gotten it out of their system, whatever they're going to do in that regard. Then later, when they stabilized and reached sort of the geriatric time of life, then they figured, then they would get baptized. And many people did that. In fact, no one less than Tertullian, who was really regarded as one of the greater Christian thinkers, encouraged people to postpone their baptism until late in their life. So Constantine wasn't doing something that was just out of hand, bizarre here to himself lapse into that particular thought. This never represented the highest and best of Christian thought, even at the time, but nevertheless there was an element in the culture that seemed to at least view that as a wise course of action. He was baptized in his 65th year in the year 337. He died about 2 months later, on May 22nd, 337. The historian Stanley, I think, gives a pretty good summary of his life. I'm going to leave our discussion of Constantine with this. Quote, "So passed away the first Christian emperor, the first defender of the faith, the first imperial patron of the Roman See and of the whole Eastern Church, the first founder of the holy places, pagan and Christian, orthodox and heretical, liberal and fanatical, not to be imitated or admired, but much to be remembered and deeply to be studied." And that, I think, is a pretty good summary. His body was carried to Constantinople in a gold coffin. Eusebius regards him as the greatest prince of all time. Gives him really glowing review. From the 5th century on in the Eastern Church, he was canonized as a saint of the church. The Greek and Orthodox churches to this day celebrate in big ways the life of Constantine. The Western Church, the Roman Catholic Church, and certainly even to a greater extent, the Protestant Church has been more modest in their appreciation of Constantine, but even among us, we have viewed him as a great and important figure in church history who rightly wins the name Constantine the Great. And so I hope this little exposure to him has walked that tightrope of balance. I neither want to overly praise him or bury him, but simply acknowledge he was what he was, and from the point of view of church history was certainly a very, very important figure.